Hi, welcome to the pilot episode of our podcast. My name is Julia.
And my name is Kwadjo. We are doing this podcast because, Julia and I talk about a lot. And ultimately, I could give this long-winded explanation of why we're doing this and what we're doing and blah, blah, blah. But it really just comes down to we have perspectives that we want to share. And hopefully you're listening because you want to participate in the conversation. You want to participate in our conversation because our conversations are really just ours because we're the only two that have them. But if more people jump in, then it's, it's their conversation too. It's your conversation too. So we want to share our perspective. We want to share our conversation with you in the hopes that you will get something valuable out of it and it will contribute to your life, hopefully in a positive way. Or, you'll learn the truth about something and it'll devastate your life and you'll be like, oh, the Matrix is real. Also possible.
Which is what happens when your awareness continues to increase. It becomes difficult to shut that off and not see things throughout the world, which is something that I think Kwadjo and I have both been working through for quite some time now, and oftentimes our conversations are about things that we're noticing and things that have that we have questions about, and our brains work very differently, which can be really wonderful because we learn different perspectives and are able to kind of ask different questions. And we often wish that some of the things that we're interested in and have questions about and the topics that we want to talk about were covered in more mainstream media, and they're not. They're covered in smaller media outlets, for which we're really grateful. So we thought this could be an opportunity too to help spread the word about some of these interests that we have and topics that we think are really important for more people to know about.
With that being said, today we're going to talk about a few things. There's a lot to talk about, obviously. And just to get it out there, it's March 29th, 2020, which means we're a couple weeks into these coronavirus austerity measures from the state, a couple weeks into most recent economic collapse. We're a few months, many months, if not years, into the 2020 presidential campaign cycle. So we're going to talk about those things. We're going to talk about coronavirus today. We're going to talk about the economy. We're going to talk about the future of our, the political implications of this whole situation. And, anything else that we get to, we get to when we get to. So, yeah.
What was that?
Yeah, just... My feet doing the work. If you know the dance, comment in the comments. You know the dance?
Okay. So as Kwadjo mentioned, we are, depending on how much you know about the coronavirus, either months, weeks, days, hours, hopefully you all know some about it, so it's not minutes, into kind of like this a global pandemic, and it's now reaching most countries, if not all countries across the world. There are a variety of responses globally, and certainly the United States is struggling through its own response and how to manage. There's a lot of misinformation that's being provided by the government. There's a lot of misinformation that's kind of like trickling down, and that everyone's become an expert, which I think is not uncommon in times like this, that everyone thinks they know the best thing to do. So we're now in the spot where we are in Georgia. Georgia is one of a handful of states that does not have any state regulations currently around businesses being open or social distancing or any necessarily well-being precautions that are mandated or requested by the government. In our city and the city next to us, there are regulations in place, but that's not true for everybody in the state. And so one of the major things right now is social distancing, which has seems to have shifted from in the past month from like loose regulations to kind of where we are now, with many of us under stay-at-home orders, which is kind of where we are. But those also seem kind of confusing and loose, like stay at home unless you need groceries or unless you're going to go outside to exercise, or if like you're an essential employee, which, you know, we don't have the power in deciding.
Yeah. Stay at home if you want to. That's where we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose that's true.
Yeah.
Stay at home if you want to, or stay at home if you want to participate in whatever this treatment is that we have right now for flattening the curve and helping to stop the virus from spreading.
One of the things, just in the sense of, I guess, clarifying stuff, if you're listening and you don't know what flattening the curve means, flattening the curve refers to the standard distribution curve of people who get the virus, or people who are infected with the virus, and the time at which they're infected, right? So you have a bar graph, or not a bar graph, line graph. You have a graph. And here is the number of people who are infected, right? No one's getting infected. Everyone's getting infected, right? It goes up. And then here you have the amount of time. Today, tomorrow, a week from now, blah, 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 okay? The curve looks like, because of the way, viruses are transmitted, it looks like that. So if you don't flatten the curve, if everyone just goes about doing what they normally do, hanging out in crowds and bars and stuff, then a lot of people are going to get infected in a very short amount of time, all right? So the curve looks very high and brief. But if you do what you're supposed to do, right? If this happens, if the curve does not get flat, what that means is because all those people are getting sick in such a short amount of time, hospitals, are going to be overcrowded. All of those people obviously are going to want to go receive some sort of medical treatment, and most people, especially in this country, for some reason, our healthcare system is obviously not the greatest, and we'll get to that. But they'll go to the hospital. So high curve, high volume of people getting sick in a short amount of time means hospitals are overwhelmed. In order to prevent hospitals from being overwhelmed, and obviously, to prevent people from dying as well, because the higher the curve is, the higher the number of people who die from the, Covid-19 are. Flatten the curve by socially isolating. What you're doing is you're taking a longer amount of time. The virus takes a longer amount of time to essentially die out. And over the course of that time, because the transmission rate is lower, people aren't going out, so people aren't giving it to other people, fewer people are being infected, okay? So instead of a really high curve, you have this low curve that, happens over a short amount of time. So instead of you have this curve, you have this curve, and this is a flatter curve, okay?
Like this.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. There, that's the high curve. And that's kind of the low curve, because the peak for the low curve would not be where that peak for the high curve is. It would be for the...
Yeah, we'll work on that. But that's what flattening the curve means. It's, as you were saying.
Yeah, so a main piece of social distancing is to flatten the curve so that we're not overwhelming the healthcare system, which has become, I'm assuming a lot of you already know about, that the healthcare systems don't have all the equipment that they need, not only the PPE, the protective equipment, but they also don't have the ventilators that they need either. And there's no nationalized plan or process in place to provide different hospitals who are in need with all of that equipment, right? Governors are being told to kind of fend for themselves, which has created some fear in terms of, and some competition in terms of trying to purchase different equipment, and there can be bidding wars, and things can be selling for a lot more than they would have been selling for 4 months ago. There wasn't until recently any nationalized production. And I still don't think there's any nationalized production of anything. I think some companies are doing that on their own because they realize that it's important and that they can still make money off of it. But a huge part in flattening the curve is to help protect our healthcare workers who, because of the lack of supplies, will also continue to become infected as they're seeing more and more and more patients with COVID-19.
Right. Okay, two things as far as prevention, right? As far as flattening that curve, not exactly tackling what to do if you get sick, but keeping other people from getting sick and keeping as few people from getting sick over for as long a time as possible. One, social isolation. Stay at home. What does that mean? And two, if you have to go out, what do you do in order to make sure that even outside of the house, you're being as safe as possible? If you want to talk about, social isolation, point one, and I'll take point two.
Okay. Yeah, so we're not experts, so I do think it's important to shout out to Dr. Fauci and to the CDC in terms of following their guidelines. So that's number one. Number two, social isolation. I mean, there are different orders in place, which will inevitably mean different things. So before our stay-at-home order, right, like people were just being told, like, socially distance, stay 6 feet away from each other, wash your hands regularly, disinfect things that are commonly touched, like door handles or things like that. Was there anything else in particular around that in terms of social distancing?
At home?
Yeah, I mean, before the stay-at-home order. I think those are the main things. And I do think it's important to mention that one of the reasons that this is so important is that you can be a carrier of COVID-19 and not know ever, or not know for several days until symptoms develop. And if you have mild symptoms, you may not think anything of it, especially given our beautiful yellow wonderland of pollen that now exists outside, right? Like, it could feel like allergies, it could feel like a cold, you just may not know. But then you may infect somebody else who has a underlying condition that would make it much more dangerous for them, or an elderly person who we know are dying at higher rates than people in different age groups. So the social distancing piece now looks a little bit different with the stay-at-home order, because you're being told not to leave your place, which is problematic in some other ways for people that don't have a place or don't have a safe place, or maybe don't have access to the things that they need, like electricity and water, and may not be able to afford their rent. But maybe we can talk about some of those things later. But it's important to isolate in pods. So like we live together. So socially isolating for us means staying at home for 14 days. And if we don't have any symptoms of anything, then cool, we could go and meet up with other folks who are also in a pod. And that I think is like the ideal situation in terms of not spreading the virus and not putting other people at risk. Now, people have differing views on that, and Kwadjo can maybe share what some of those other options are.
So as far as, picking up on what Julia just said, if staying at home is not feasible, if it's not something that you're super comfortable with, if it's not something that you're doing, even if everyone should do it. Ideally, everyone would do it. So keep that in mind. If you're not doing it, what can you do to stay safe? What can you do to make sure that everyone else stays safe? And how can you be as safe as possible while not staying at home? I think, one point to consider is this point of percentages, okay? So social isolation, social distancing, in a big sense, it's about reducing, right? The ultimate goal is to reduce as much as you can the amount of contact that you have with other people and with the outside world. So Julie and I were going on a couple weeks having almost reduced to 0% unnecessary contact with people outside of the house. That means if it's not for work or food, then we don't interact with other people. Between that reduction of 100% and 0%, there's a whole bunch of degrees. Reducing, right, as much as you can. 30%, reducing to 30% contact, reducing to 20% contact. If you're a person who hangs out with 10 different people every week, and you're like, oh, I can't live without people, then hang out with 2 different people every week, right? hang out with 1, hang out with 3. Don't hang out with 10, okay? Don't hang out with 9, really. You should make some sort of adjustment like that. But reducing by that percentage will help flatten the curve, because every person you don't hang out with is a point of contact that vanishes, right?
I would add into that too, before we move on to the next thing. And this is something that just kind of occurred to me now. So even if you are spending time with fewer people each week, if the people that you're spending time with are spending time with everybody they would normally spend time with, like that's something that you need to think about too, because that's one of the things that's so dangerous about COVID compared to other illnesses that are happening, is that it's an easily transferable respiratory illness. And so it brings up kind of this point about these conversations that you may never have had to have before with like your friends or people you care about, right? Which is like, hey, like this is what I need to do to stay safe for whatever reason it may be for you. And then asking your friend or person or family member or sister, whoever it might be, to like make this kind of agreement with you, which I think is probably something that a lot of us probably haven't had to do before in our lives, and it's probably kind of like a new thing, but it feels really important right now for you to stay safe and for people you love to stay safe.
Right. That's a really good point. Be proactive as far as letting people know what you personally need from the people who you will be in touch with. If you're a higher risk person for suffering under coronavirus, then be proactive as far as letting people know, hey, this is what Julia said. This is what I need from you. This is what I need from the people I'm hanging out with. On the other end, if you're a person who doesn't fit into that first category, then you fit into the second category, which is be a person who's proactive as far as making sure that if you're going to put yourself in a situation where you're going to be a potential carrier for the virus, then you're also making sure that the people you're hanging out with are not going to be putting other people in danger by hanging out with you, So if Julia's like, hey, I need a, if Julia comes to me and she's like, oh, I've got an underlying condition, and I don't want to get coronavirus. That's cool. I'll be, we're talking on the phone about, okay, well then, thanks for letting me know. I'm going to go over here and, social isolate from you to keep you safe, right? On the other end, if Julia is not the type of person who normally, would let me know, then that puts it on me to know, right? If I know Julia has an underlying condition and Julia doesn't say anything and we're about to hang out, I need to be the person who's like, hey, or even if I don't know, hey, do you have an underlying condition that I should know about? That way I don't put her at risk, right? Because maybe personally, I don't have any underlying conditions, or I'm not like an elderly person, right? I'm not a higher risk coronavirus case. But that's, right, there's this whole issue of social responsibility, okay? Even beyond the friendship component, right? Because we know each other, our friends know each other, and we're all friends, but that doesn't mean, right, that I can't walk out on the street and put someone else in danger. Especially there's a lot of old people in this neighborhood. They're older. I don't know how old they are, but
also lots of younger people are contracting coronavirus too and getting hospitalized. So
yeah, that's true, because this is America, and anyway.
I would also consider you to think of poverty as an underlying condition. So when you think about your trips to the grocery store, right, like best not to hoard because that's problematic for a lot of reasons. And also the essential workers who are on the front lines dealing with everybody who's freaking out are people in grocery stores who are working minimum wage jobs, most of them not getting paid sick leave, so they would be afraid to take time off anyways for fear of losing their jobs probably. They likely don't have benefits, and so I think that's an important piece too in terms of thinking about, okay, I don't want to hoard, but also like limiting your trips to interact with those folks too who are interacting with a lot of people, so you don't know what's going to happen there, and also like helping to protect them the best way that you can because our government is not doing that.
Yeah. There's this really, it's a meme thread, and I just feel like it's really appropriate. I guess it's not even a meme thread. Just the idea that as far as being altruistic in society, there aren't many opportunities that are going to come up where you have the chance to help save the world by literally doing as little as you can, you know? So just keep that in mind. This is your moment to shine, right? All you have to do is literally do less, hang out with people less, hang out with people not at all, stay at home, take that sick day, anyway, that gets into a whole bunch of other stuff, but original point still stands.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to, like, just because you can't hang out with people, like, go to their place. There are lots of ways now to communicate and interact with people, and it may be a different way than you're used to. But keeping that connection is really important for mental health, for general well-being, for continuing to build and maintain relationships. So do some of those things. I mean, I hate getting on like Zoom or answering FaceTime sometimes, but like seeing that person and getting to have that different kind of interaction versus simply like texting or talking on the phone, I think can be really helpful. You can play games virtually. You can do Netflix party, which I really thought was going to be a little bit more exciting than it ended up being. No. But that's cool. You could probably make it more exciting if you also like video chatted during it. You can play like Animal House or whatever that thing is.
Crossing.
Animal Crossing. You can do like virtual reality stuff. Like, right, there's also this time that you can figure out how to connect differently and maybe have different kinds of relationships with people too. I forget what point 2 was after social distancing and something else.
So if you're not at home, if you have to go out, right. And it's whether it's essential or non-essential, these are some things you can do to make sure that you're keeping yourself safe as well as keeping other people safe. In that context, right? Of course, the safest thing to do is to stay away from people. But there's degrees of safety outside of that as well. 1, stay 6 to 15 feet away from whoever you're interacting with. Because, studies, I don't know about studies, but people say, right, the CDC recommends you stay at least 6 feet away from people. Other articles have come out saying the virus can be transmitted as far as 15 feet away from people, or 15 feet away from the epicenter. So 6 to 15 feet away from people. Just keep that in mind. That range is really important because a lot of people go around, they're like, oh, I'll just stay 6 feet away. But that doesn't mean that you're safe. You're out of the danger zone. It just means that you're out of like the red zone. But if you think of 6 to 15, right? 0 to 6 feet, that's the red zone. Stay out of there. 6 to 15 feet is like the orange and yellow zone. Further than 15 feet is like, some other zone. And then you're at home and there's no one around. That's the green zone. All right. So you do that. And then also the virus can stick around on surfaces, hard wood, plastic, steel, metal surfaces for between hours to days, which is a really important thing to keep in mind as well. So 1, washing your hands because you go out and you touch things that other people have touched, especially in public places, doorknobs, sinks even, right? The faucet, okay? So keep stuff like that in mind. Wash your hands, and then also if you're in a public space where you have that kind of control to clean stuff, then disinfect things in that space too. If you're going outside, you're tossing the football around, make sure you've got hand sanitizer in your pocket that you can and like clean the football after every toss. Because what did Pele say? We got a friend, he saw people throwing a frisbee outside at the park, and he called it a pandemic missile, and that's pretty appropriate. Point is, make sure you're washing your hands, make sure you're disinfecting your environment, and make sure that you're staying 6 to 15 feet away from other people, even if you don't think they have the virus, even if they don't look like they're sick, okay? If you're walking on the sidewalk, if you're running on the sidewalk, and coming, just be mindful of space on sidewalks and places where, stuff like that. Hold your breath. So those are Kwadjo's tips for staying safe while physical distancing in public.
I would also add in, and I don't know if Kwadjo will agree with this, if you feel like you need to leave the house, I would ask yourself what you feel like you need to do and if it's a need or a want, and maybe take yourself a few steps down kind of that process, because I think those words get conflated quite a bit. And that doesn't mean that like it's not okay to leave the house. I just think it's now feels like a time where we could all reflect a little bit on how we affect each other, and how we could change that potentially if it feels like it needs to be changed.
Well said.
I just want to circle back for a moment because we didn't talk that much about healthcare and healthcare workers and stuff too. And I don't know the best way to go about talking about that or what else might need to be said about that. But, what I just said in terms of like reflecting on why you think, like why you need to leave the house or why you want to leave the house. I don't think that people need to be one-upped in terms of like, oh, there are worse things that can be happening to you right now. But I do think it's important to think about the people who are making significant sacrifices so that we can all get the care that we need if we need it, and so that we can all stay as safe as possible, and some of the things that they're going through. When you're thinking about the decisions that you're making in terms of like washing your hands or leaving the house or whatever you're buying or however you're choosing to support people, keep them in mind.
Yeah. That includes nurses, doctors, medical professionals for sure. They're already working crazy hours, even like outside of, a pandemic. And now it's a situation where they're still working those crazy hours. And this actually ties in pretty well to the economy because we'll get there. But they're working those hours. They're working mad hours. They've had to, a major part of revenue for hospitals, right? And obviously revenue and profit, that's how doctors and nurses and medical professionals get paid. A lot of hospitals make money off of this thing called elective surgeries. And those are essentially operations that people can elect to have. It's not life-saving. It's not, your life doesn't depend on it. Plastic surgery is included. Do we get into, there's a lot of things that are included in elective surgery that, abortion is the thing, right? It's in there.
Mm-hmm.
Abortion and plastic surgery do not really fit into that same category. But the point is, for now, that a lot of hospitals are getting rid of those elective surgeries, elective operations, which puts them at a impaired ability to pay their workers, which means not only are doctors working medical professionals, because across the board, including janitors, right? Including custodial engineers, are working really insane hours. And they're at risk of getting paid less for it. And they're at risk for getting sick, right? Which puts them in a situation where, because, the hospitals aren't making money, because the state, the government apparatus is not on the ball as far as making sure that medical professionals are provided for, make sure they have everything they need, make sure they have masks, ventilators, air filtration systems, all of the above. These medical professionals are putting themselves at risk of getting sick, which, just adds on to a whole lot of, Julia was telling me earlier about, right, the risk of PTSD for a lot of medical professionals, especially in this time because of all the things that we just mentioned. Plus, if a doctor gets sick and they have a family, if a nurse gets sick and they have a family, if anyone medical professional gets sick and they have a family, now they have to isolate from their family. And logically, statistically, the more people social isolate in general, the better people do about it, the more we reduce as a whole our contact with each other, with one another, the fewer medical professionals have to go through this.
And the fewer their families have to go through it.
The fewer their families have to go through it. Which is a really good point. That maybe we should make this a thing in the podcast is, there's this really individualistic way of looking at the world that we tend to have as Americans that almost across the board, anytime you hear these numbers about statistics, right? Even right now, what's the statistic? So many thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in the United States and easily across the world have coronavirus. But you multiply that by, there's a multiplier effect because all of those people have families to some extent. So, this pandemic, it affects people. People are being infected, but just because you're not infected doesn't mean you're not affected by what's going on. And medical professionals are especially included in that because they're in this by profession, and they're essentially the people who are the most involved in this who, it is a sacrifice. We can choose to stay at home and socially isolate, and I have to go to work. I do go to work somewhere else, but the risk I'm taking in doing that is not the same as the risk that any medical professional takes, because I'm assuming that when I go to work, the people who show up there, it's not a whole lot of people at all, which is part of why I do it. It's like 4 people total. When I show up there, I'm assuming that, one, everyone else is also taking the same precautions I am taking in social distancing and social isolating and not going out if they don't need to go out. And 2, I'm assuming that if they don't feel well, if they feel like under the weather or they might be sick, they're not going to show up, right? Whereas, if you work in a hospital, if this is your expectation, then while you should also have the liberty to not show up, one, the symptoms for this virus don't kick in. It can take up to 2 weeks for you to experience symptoms. Meanwhile, over the course of those 2 weeks, you've been carrying the symptoms. And while you're carrying those symptoms, you're also infecting other people with it, right? So it puts those medical professionals in a really precarious situation that they shouldn't need to be in. And to Julia's point, the longer it takes for us collectively as a people to get it together and, stop interacting with each other for 2 weeks, the more at risk those medical professionals are.
Yeah. And then I think, one additional piece, right? Because it kind of feels like we're going step by step down, kind of like what could happen down the road. And I'll just add one additional thing too, which is we haven't seen the peak of the virus, according to many professionals. And one of the huge dangers that is going to happen if people don't take more significant precautions is that there aren't going to be beds available for people who are experiencing a heart attack or like appendicitis or, whatever it is that could also be life-threatening, because all of those beds are going to be taken up now with patients who have been diagnosed with COVID, or even if there are beds, it might not really be a safe place anymore to be, or there might not be a ventilator available if you have something other than COVID. And it's exposing, right, like a lot of issues in our healthcare system that people, it's not exposing them. It's bringing it to the mass, right?
Attention.
To mass attention. They've already been exposed by many, many, many people and many activists doing wonderful work. But that's another thing that could potentially happen too, because there's not enough beds. There's not enough rooms. I don't know what's going to happen to people, and this is a diversion of something we haven't talked about. I don't know what's going to happen to people who are feeling suicidal, who have a plan to kill themselves. Usually they get sent to an emergency room. What's going to happen now, right? We're going to start to see, I think, everything get overwhelmed in all areas of healthcare if things aren't taken more seriously. And I think that's one of the difficult things about like prevention work too, is that if you do prevention appropriately, you don't get a reward. Like you don't see anything. Nothing happens, right? It's not like, oh, we did prevention, so like we have X result.
And that is the reward. The reward is that you don't see people get sick because people are staying healthy.
Right. It's not like with secondary or tertiary prevention where it's like, okay, we can intervene and do this treatment and then we see this person get better, right? It's like if you're doing primary prevention, nothing gets better because nothing got sick in the first place, or bad or whatever it was. So that's the last point I want to make about that piece.
Boom. Y'all have any questions?
It's not live.
Just kidding.
You can still ask us questions though, and we'll,
Yeah.
answer them in the next go round, or we'll comment back to you once we figure out how we're gonna
whatever
operate
platform
this.
we post this to, take this opportunity and put some stuff in the comments, send us some questions. And in general, like, send us questions because, like we said at the beginning, part of the point of this is to invite you into a conversation. And listening is a great way to engage in a conversation, and also asking questions and providing inputs. So,
you can leave your questions. You can also leave your perspectives if we miss things, if you disagree with us, if you agree with us. Like, we love all those things, so send them along.
Yeah, we especially love it if you disagree with us.
Sometimes.
Because we know y'all haters out there.
You want to shift to a more focused conversation about the economy?
We're really quick.
Take it away.
And I don't know how quick to make it, but the economy does seem like, a nice sorry,
quick.
I don't know how
Real
quick
quick
I
is like
can
10
make
minutes.
it.
Yeah, so buckle up.
So we are, man. So, I mean, there's a lot to say, and there's a lot that people have said already. And for the most part, I'm going to be repeating a lot of it and providing whatever novel inputs, that we can as we go along. One of the big things to pay attention to about the economy and how it's doing and what these statistics mean is that ostensibly the cause for the collapse of the economy, as everyone knows, is the coronavirus. The coronavirus, people stopped going to work. I don't mean people stopped going to work. I mean companies stopped allowing people to come to work. States did the same. And
People got laid off.
Right. Massive layoffs. A lot of people were fired because companies had to, because companies did not, essentially, a lot of people got fired because companies did not want to pay for, right? A lot of companies don't already, as it is, want to pay for benefits, sick leave, like a bunch of the things that Julia mentioned. So people definitely, as far as companies that operate here in the States are concerned, do not want to make it a point of habit to pay for people to not work indefinitely. And that is, it's problematic, because where's people's obligation to workers, in other states, and it'd be different if, right, companies here did not want to do that, but the state was like, I'll take you up on that, and we'll look out for you. And by state, I mean government. In, England, the government is paying for like 80% of people's like salaries. It's in Canada, the government's paying for some other percentage of people, right, who are not working at the time. Here, what's the big thing? The stimulus package. You get a one-time check of $1,200, and you get some post-dated unemployment insurance benefits. Right?
If you have a social security number.
If you have a social security number. There's a lot of red tape, and right? And that's one of the things. So I guess as far as the economy is concerned, brief overview, coronavirus hits, and our economic system in general depends on instability. It's inherently unstable, and essentially, right, like we've been overdue for an economic collapse for a long time. The way the last one was handled, for those of you who are old enough to remember, in 2008, it was not handled in such a way as to prevent a future one. It was handled very much in the sense that you give these big name companies, give the big banks, give large corporations all of this money that we created, and you do it at really low rates, give out loans, and people are accepting money. Banks are accepting loans at negative interest rates, which means they're getting paid to borrow money.
No oversight.
No oversight, right? I mean, that's crucial because, So, 2008, that's how things were handled. And just, that didn't solve any of the problems that made the collapse happen in the first place. So we've been overdue, like I said. Some people, I remember 4 years ago being like, oh man, it's going to happen any moment now. And then it didn't happen. And honestly, Trump went into office and was able to stave it off for a while. And I would give him credit for that. Not, because I like him or I like what he does, but because if he has any one real vested interest in, making change, it's the economy, because he's got money in there, right? Mm-hmm. And his donors, his cronies, his cohort is also very much invested in the economy. So it makes sense that they would have been able to delay something like this indefinitely, or not indefinitely, but up until this current moment. And then you add onto that this coronavirus situation coinciding with the collapse of the economy, while the raw figures, right, all of these people not working, all of these people not going out and not consuming, consuming whatever products they normally produce recreationally or leisurely, all of these things happening, it makes sense that there would be a dip in the economy, right? But there was this huge crash. I think we're officially in a recession. Actually, no, it's probably too soon, because I think a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of, a downturn. And I think this has only been one. But the coronavirus is essentially a scapegoat. What I'm saying is, it makes sense that the coronavirus would have corresponded to an economic dip. But coronavirus is not the reason that our economy is tanking. Our economy is tanking because it's unstable and because it was inevitable, right? It's overdue, right? If you have a library book and you get charged all these fines, you might, open the mailbox one day and be like, oh my gosh, I have all these receipts, like all these fines because you haven't checked the mail in 2 weeks. You didn't get those fines because you opened the mailbox. They were already in there. You were going to find out that you had those fines. It just happened because you opened the mailbox. Coronavirus is open in the mailbox. So that's a quick primer on how the economy is doing and why. Last week, last week, today's Sunday. Thursday, 3.3 million people filed for unemployment, which is huge, right? The unemployment rate, if it's not already at 20%, is reaching 20%. During the Great Depression, it was at 40%. So, that's just a point of reference. And a few months ago, right, what's the main thing? That's one of the main metrics. Generally, to measure the economy in this country, we use a handful of metrics: GDP, unemployment, jobless statistics, other stuff, as if that handful of metrics tells us everything we need to know. The stock market is one of those metrics. Tells us everything we need to know about how the economy is doing. Stock market 3 months ago was doing great. It was still hitting record highs. Unemployment numbers were, they were also looking really good. And again, they were looking really good. and that means, what was it, like 3%, 3 point something percent. It's pretty low. Unemployment is how many people are not looking for a job because they have a job. And I forget what the other one I said was.
Stock market, GDP.
Oh, GDP. I don't know what GDP is. Yeah, who needs to? The point is, if the stock market's doing good and people are working, it's probably doing pretty good. But the health of the economy, so, economist Dr. Richard Wolff has this really good way of putting it, is that essentially the health of the economy hinges on more than those three metrics, right? If you go to the doctor and you say, hey, doctor, I'm sick, and yourself and you're like, yeah, I'm really sick, I've got a fever and, my chest hurts all the time and, my muscles are sore and, I don't work out. And I go and I'm like, oh, I'm really sick. And the doctor's like, okay, let me take a look at you. And he said the thing about, and he takes out a measuring instrument and measures the width between your big toe and your index toe. And he's like, okay, that's, you're fine. This is normal. And you'll be like, okay, yes, that's a very interesting metric that tells me nothing about, how I'm feeling or how I'm actually doing, right? Even if it's coming from a medical professional in this case, which is not a jab at medical professionals. It's just really a jab at this notion of economic expertise, right? Because a big thing to keep in mind, I think, is that people aren't saying that the economy is doing well in a vacuum. People are saying, right, like Trump goes up there and he's like, the economy's doing great. Jobless numbers are low. The stock market's doing great. GDP's great. And then he has this whole crew of economists who also back what he's saying, right? So you can look at him and be like, yeah, he's, what the fuck? But then you can also look at these economists who have degrees and, are tenured in whatever institutions they're in, and they're reputable and credible, and they're saying the same thing, which is cause for concern. Of course, there's other people like, Richard Wolff who go out there and tell it like it is. And then events like this happen, and we see, that is how it is, right? The economy hasn't been doing great. It just, people have been telling us it's been doing great, and we've been comfortable enough to agree with those people. So I don't really know what to say. I mean, the stimulus package is the other recent thing, other than that huge job employment number from a few days ago. And, I don't know the details of the package very in depth. But I do know that, but based on what I do know, it's not a package for the people, right? It's very similar to what happened in 2008. The amount of money in that package is unprecedented. It's huge, right? Trillions of dollars. The working class, what is it, gets 500 billion to like $1 or $2 trillion, which goes into, right, those unemployment benefit, unemployment insurance boosts, and that one-time deposit of $1,200, if you apply for it and if you have a social security number, like if you pass and there's means testing, right? Which means that in other countries, right, like where you have nationalized healthcare, Medicare for all, in other countries and stuff. Anyway, so in other countries, you get things because you live in that country and because, the country's looking out for you. You're working, you're contributing to the overall health of that economy. You should get these things for that. Not because you have a social security number, not because you have a job, not because you make so much a year, right? Means testing means you don't just get this thing because you're here. You have to pass these tests to get the thing, which is another messed up thing, right? There's a classist component to it. There's a anti-working class component to it, because at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is there's a lot of people who aren't going to pass those tests who do deserve to be looked out for. And you couple that with like Julia said earlier, lack of oversight and accountability for the corporations that are going to get up to $4 trillion out of this benefit, out of this stimulus package, and it just creates this crazy, dichotomy where poor people are having to prove that they deserve this money on the one hand, and then the rich people who are getting literally most of the money in the package aren't being beholden to any serious stipulations, any serious means testing as far as whether or not they deserve the money, what they plan to do with the money, and how what they plan to do with the money is going to contribute to the economy and prevent future collapses. Because 9 times out of 10, as far as recent history is concerned, the economy doesn't collapse because working people choose to stop or because working people are being less productive or any of that stuff, right? The economy collapses because the people at the top who are making all the decisions, who already have the money and are making more money and making decisions so that they can make more money, which happens because those same decisions also prevent the people who are working at the bottom from having more money. Those people do something and then, it's like, we were fiscally irresponsible. And then, now everyone's suffering, except we're still, mega millionaires up there. I'm not. Julia's not. We're not mega millionaires. But, I'm speaking as if I was a mega millionaire corporatist type.
I think, another thing that feels like it fits in here is that, so the EPA has announced that they're not going to be enforcing the same standards for companies to meet as they have before, because they know that companies aren't making as much money to provide salaries for whoever their people would be who are supposed to be in charge of making sure those companies are following the rules, right? And now we're talking about giving tons of money to these corporations where they could, if there was some oversight, be required to pay that salary of that group of people so that they could continue to be following EPA, so that we're not also going to be illegally dumping waste or whatever it might be, so that people are still following regulations. But without the oversight, right, other parts of our world and our lives are going to be affected as they always are. And I also think, there are some things that could have gone in the bill that wouldn't have necessarily required additional money, but could have been statements around, halting student loan payments, halting rent payments, a requirement that electricity and water stay on for every single household in the country, things like that, so that people, right, when you start to think about it, people need water to wash their hands. If you don't have access to water because you can't pay your water bill because you've been laid off, and then the government gives you $1,200, which isn't going to cover everything you need for however many more weeks this is going on, how are you possibly taking the appropriate precautions to keep yourself safe and everyone in your community safe? Yeah.
So, one of the things that Julia mentioned as far as the EPA having no oversight and all the implications of that, right? Because we see that there's no oversight, and now we see that because of that lack of oversight, workers are suffering, policies are obviously suffering, and because workers and policies are suffering, the environment itself is suffering.
Which has already been suffering.
Which has already been suffering, yes. And is going through some degree of suffering less now that people aren't going outside or traveling as much globally. But, one of the questions, obviously, that arises from that is, how does a government organization, right? Because the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is an agency that's designed to regulate what we do to protect the environment. Regulatory capture describes a process by which corporations can infiltrate the offices that are designed and intended to regulate them. And in that infiltration, they make policies that benefit the corporations in the first place. Mm-hmm. And it creates this feedback loop.
It's like the people with the prison industrial complex.
Right.
I forget what you call the group now, though.
Ooh, the CCC? Core Civic?
Maybe, yeah. with the group of all the companies who are invested.
Oh,
right?
ALEC.
Okay.
ALEC. Yeah, American Legislative something. I forget what it is. But yeah, that's
We
a
don't
really
need to
good
go
point.
down that rabbit hole though.
Yeah. I mean, but it's a good rabbit hole to go down, right? Like it's a policy making group, right? It's a policy consulting group. ALEC. ALEC. Look it up. Definitely look it up. What private companies want in a free market is less regulation. So these ALEC meetings, they're like, oh, let's regulate less. And then lawmakers go to this. And the same lawmakers who are going to these... There we go. Our little lobbyist. The same lawmakers who are... Anyway, this is, long story short. ALEC is a really good example of that. It's a bunch of different companies. It's a conglomerate of companies who associate to push their agendas to lawmakers, right? And that comes with money, it comes with benefits, it comes with everything but bribes, right? Because technically none of them are bribes. But if you, right, that is off topic. It is technically off topic as far as the economy is concerned. But it's also really important for people to pay attention to because, in the same way that regulatory capture and lack of oversight and what's going on with the EPA right now reflects how you expect these institutions and programs to be accountable to you as a voter and as a citizen, in the same way that that is the same way that you expect like the Supreme Court, or a lot of people expect the Supreme Court to be accountable to them as citizens, right? Non-partial, non-biased citizens, and arbiters of justice in the United States. But the reality reflects a different leaning, right? The reality reflects the EPA as a program that has been purchased by the people that it's designed to regulate so that it can regulate them less. That includes oil, that includes, environment companies, fossil fuels, and other stuff. And in the same way, the Supreme Court reflects like people who are bought, right? Everyone knows this about politicians, but people don't think of it often as far as judges are concerned, or organizations like IPA. That's probably pretty good for the economy. Not good for the economy, but I mean good for as far as our coverage of the economy right now. Unless you have anything to add.
No.
Okay, so it's getting late, and this is running pretty long. The last section that we're going to cover is politics, the political implications.
Remember when you
of
said you were
everything
going to
that's
cover
on.
the economy
Really quick,
quickly, and
yeah.
you did it in more than 30 minutes?
And well, there was a cat in the middle, and he's just so cute.
Okay, what's the last section?
We're talking about the political implications of everything we've been talking about before. And to that, I would preface by saying that I'm definitely voting for Bernie Sanders very soon in this primary, and that's really important to vote for him in the primary, because if you don't vote for him in the primary, you won't have the chance to vote for him in the general election, or at least that's not a certainty. Julia?
Yes?
Political implications.
Yeah, so, I mean, there are a lot at all different levels of government, and I think Kwadjo's very detailed description of the economy, and especially the latter part of it, demonstrates the need to vote in local elections. And so I think, like one of the political implications that's very visible that's happening, right, is now people are calling for testing for everyone and treatment for everyone, and everyone should have access, because if they don't, then other people are going to get sick, and la 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 la, right? And that our society is only as healthy as the most unhealthy person right now, because people don't have access to things anymore, or never did. Right, so there are all these now calls for everything that's been in Bernie's platform and other progressive platforms in the past from people who never even made it to mainstream media coverage, who are running for high government offices. So I think that, that's kind of an interesting wave to see, especially in terms of like Biden and Bernie in the primary right now and where they're standing and what the mainstream media is choosing to cover, et cetera, and how Bernie has turned his campaign contributions into a relief fund as opposed to like focusing on his campaign. He's trying to focus on like helping folks.
In this coronavirus situation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess he's always focused on trying to help people. But yeah,
That's
like specifically now.
Yeah. And it's one of those things, sorry, just to jump in real quick, that a lot of people, I mean, the mainstream media is overlooking this big time. Julie was telling me about, NPR's coverage of the Bernie Sanders, that shift from campaigning to relief, which is it's a huge thing, but it's also portrayed in such a way as to suggest that he's out of the race. Bernie Sanders is very much still in the race for president, right, against Joe Biden, and I feel like this really illustrates very clearly one of the huge oversights, right? In the same way that people were not paying attention to how bad the economy was until it crashed, people aren't going to pay attention to how good Bernie Sanders is as a candidate and as a potential president until it's too late and we don't have that leadership. What he's doing right now is he's taking a point of leadership as far as, it's the big question. What's Donald Trump going to do to handle this crisis? What's Joe Biden going to do to handle this crisis? What Donald Trump has done is, I mean, if you know, let us know. Put it in the comments.
He's lied.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah, he's lied.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
What has Joe Biden done? He's literally disappeared and then
babbled incoherently,
for sure. And, more substantively, he's copied everything that Bernie Sanders said, copied everything that has already been done, right? Like, Trump has done whatever he's done. Joe Biden has done nothing, plus spout the ideas of Bernie Sanders and the actions that the Trump administration has already taken. He's done less than like anyone has. And then Bernie Sanders is fundraising, right? He's fundraising. He's doing this relief fund to help the working class. He's always been about the working class, right? And that's the working class of any color because it's a class. Class transcends color. He's helping the working class. He's
fighting for the stuff to get into the bill.
Right. Like he's working. Like he's doing his job as a senator for the people, which is crazy. I do almost always forget that. But then they live streamed his speech the other day from like the Senate floor, and he was just as impassioned as ever, and it's really crazy because like Julia said, like this situation, the coronavirus situation, and what it's elucidated about the healthcare system, what it's elucidated about the economy, what it's elucidated about work. These are things that Bernie Sanders, as a presidential campaigner, has been saying for the past 6 years. These are things that he's been saying in his career for decades, right? And he's been consistent about these things. And now he's making it a point to not only take a point of leadership as a presidential candidate, which, any presidential candidate could do, and he's the only one who's really doing it in any meaningful way, but he's also doubling down on his job as a senator to represent, a senator who represents the people. Like in this stimulus package, as, unsatisfactory as it is, the good parts of it, right? The part where the working class gets money, those are, we have him to thank for that, essentially, right? There's like 4 other people, who also deserve credit, and I can't name them off the top of my head, but it's worth looking into. We encourage you to look into that stuff. But that's just, he's the one. Just vote for him. Your primary's probably been delayed by a couple of months. If you live in Georgia, the primary's been delayed till May 19th. So you have until May 19th to vote for Bernie Sanders. I'm not going to tell you to vote for anyone else as far as, president's concerned, because literally, where's Joe? No one else is even available, right?
Literally, who cares? But,
Yeah.
and I think, like, right, obviously, we are Bernie supporters in this current moment.
And every moment.
And I think, too, though, that, I mean, like, the piece about leadership is a really interesting one, right? Like, people are always calling for, like, a leader to be doing something, to be acting, to be, like, seeing things in advance, and to have this vision, and to be fulfilling this vision, and to be true to their word. And we have somebody, I mean, there are lots of somebodies, right, in our country who are doing those things. And one of those people is, well, a couple of them probably are running for president, and one of them is running for president from one of the two parties that our presidents are always elected from. But that can be a different podcast, right? And so, like, I mean, that's a piece to hold on to in terms of political implications. There are a lot of other political implications too, I think, that are going on, which is that governors have a major role to play right now, because Trump has basically said, Trump and Pence, like, governors are responsible for getting all the healthcare equipment and for taking care of everything, because they're refusing to do the, whatever the thing is about the national defense something, whatever, to, like, nationalize everything and develop a national strategy, and then, you know, be able to distribute things and to have a plan that everyone's following and can feel, like, safe and secure in. So governors have a really, really critical role, and they're also being threatened. So there's some interesting, like, implications, I think, that could come out of this too. I mean, Gretchen Whitmer is being basically, like, you know, bad-mouthed by the president and threatened because she's trying to get ventilators and PPE for her hospitals, and they're one of the hot spots, so she's trying to navigate this. Cuomo is trying to, like, navigate all his stuff in New York, and then the president is, like, making these comments, right? So they're trying to do all these things. Here in Georgia, Governor Kemp has done pretty much nothing in terms of, like, a statewide response. And it makes me really curious about, because this is such a crisis for so many people and is going to affect so many of us, like, what the future implications are going to be in terms of how we're going to remember some of these people, who's going to step up to do what, who's going to hold back to wait for information from the White House about what to do, if it's going to, like, create some sort of, like, pretty significant political shift in our country. A lot of people are talking about this as a reset time, which, I mean, I don't think is accurate in any capacity in terms of the, like, large scale shifts that could happen, right? Otherwise, I mean, we just covered it with the economy, right? Like, the rich people are going to literally get richer off of this and then have more power. So I don't necessarily think that we're going to become a socialist country.
I disagree.
Okay.
I definitely think we're in a reset, right? I think it is helpful to think of this as a reset, both on a personal level, as far as, you know, on a level, any level that scales larger than that, right? From personal to the political and societal level. And the reason I say that is because, one, on a personal level, just anytime things change, really on all the levels, anytime things change significantly, it's a good point to reevaluate where you are and what you're doing and what you want to be doing. So societally, I feel like a lot of people are resistant to change, reluctant to change, unwilling to change, apathetic. And I think apathy is really, it's the key. People don't care to bring about change. One, because people don't feel like it's worth it. People don't feel like anything's going to happen. Two, people don't know how to make things change. And three, I mean, and this goes to point two, it's hard to make things change when the systems that keep things going are working really well. That's not the case right now. Right now, there's a lot of things, like we've said, right? Not only is the system essentially stopped, grinded to a halt, but it's not clear what things are going to look like when we get out of this. You know,
Or even when we're at the peak of it.
Or when we're at the peak of it, right.
Yeah.
So not only has it been ground to a halt, but we've already got this whole slew of things that are becoming more prevalent in the public consciousness, right? Healthcare being tied to jobs instead of being guaranteed by the government. right, jobs themselves being these things that employers who are already making billions of dollars off of our work can just, switch off at the drop of a hat, right?
Yeah. Or
Housing.
wages, I think would be more accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wages. Boom. Wages and like the jobs themselves, because there's also, right, there's alternatives to the way jobs are structured, right? Instead of having these CEOs at the top who are making billions of dollars, these corporations, these companies can literally be worker owned and worker run, right? How many of those, how many people do you work with who have been working there so long that they know everything about the way the company is run, needs to run, and they have great ideas about how to make things better, but they're not being listened to because they're like, they're where you are or lower or like just above, right? But they're not at the top, so they can't call the shots. There's plenty of examples all over the world and throughout history of, situations in which worker-run operations work, right? And you could argue that that's one of the oldest ways of doing things in the world, right? Like CEOs haven't been a thing, but I'm not going to get into that. But I do think we are at a really important moment. We're at a pivotal moment where, depending on how our consciousness develops from here, we can change things, and we can change things for the better, right? We can take advantage of this reset period as a collective. We can study, we can learn what the problems are, right? We can just look out and see what the problems are, and we can understand how those came about. We can ask questions, we can seek guidance, and we can organize. We can team up with people, and we can say, hey, I was resistant, I was reluctant to change before because the system was going, and I didn't know if it was going to make any much of a difference. But now at this time, now that I've had a chance to sit down and breathe, now that I, am either comfortable in that opportunity to sit down and breathe, or super uncomfortable because that opportunity to sit down and breathe also came with getting kicked out of my job, and now I don't have a check, right? Like this whole unemployment thing, the 3 million people plus signing up for unemployment a few days ago. When you sign up for unemployment, what that means is that for the most part, you still have a chance, right? You're not at rock bottom yet. You've got some sort of security blanket, ideally, right? What we're anticipating, especially given this bill, is that in a month, when money runs out, in 2 months when money runs out, if this situation lasts a whole year and money runs out, right, that's going to be a lot of people who are looking at this, and they're going to be like, okay, they're not necessarily going to see it as a reset period because, right, that you see it as a reset period when you're like calm and like level-headed. I'm like, okay, I can reset.
Or if it's something that's different from your usual way of life, which also for a lot of people isn't the case necessarily.
Yes. Right. So that is another really important point, is that the coronavirus crisis is a crisis because there's an argument to me. I'm not saying that this is the way things are, but this is a point, is that it's a crisis because things that affect the upper classes are considered crises, right? If everyone goes out and now anyone can get sick, right? Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of England, has the coronavirus. Top level U.S. government officials are getting the coronavirus, right? It's this thing, it's a beast, it's a virus that kills people, and they're, suddenly have a vested interest in the collective being responsible and putting an end to this crisis. But the coronavirus pandemic crisis is really not much compared to people who've been facing their own crises, the crisis of poverty, the crisis of housing insecurity, the crisis of not having healthcare, or the crisis of extreme debt. There's so many crises day in and day out that is a good point. Like for a lot of people, they will feel unaffected. As far as not unaffected, but they will.
It won't feel like a reset. It won't feel like a drastic change necessarily from their daily lives, perhaps.
Right. This reset period is a reset period because people who wouldn't have otherwise been engaged whether they're of, that group of people who have been experiencing the crisis of, American life for years now, or for weeks or for months, right? Outside of the pandemic crisis, there's people in that group who are ready to change, right? People get to that point, they're like, oh, this American dream is, it's really a nightmare. And I want to make it a dream. So people are working, activating, organizing to make that happen. In the same way that people get to that point of activism from like major life-shifting events, people are going to reach that point due to this crisis, the pandemic, the corona crisis. People are going to reach that point. And then there's also like the sense that things are stopping. The machine is stopping. The machine is resting. It's taking a breath. And if we give it time to breathe, then it's going to come back, like Julia said, and right, it's going to come back the same or harder, right? But that breath, that moment of pause, that sensation that things can be different and that things have slowed down enough as far as the machine's concerned to allow people to step into that difference, I think that's going to activate even more people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a hopeful outlook, and I don't disagree that it's possible. I think something that you mentioned a little bit ago ties back in nicely with what we were talking about at the beginning, which was this idea of collective action, right? So, like, if people are looking at this as a time where we can get together and push policies and ideas and things that are going to benefit the collective, then that's a wonderful thing. And that I do think, right, like that the same then, like the prevention piece is also tied into that as well in terms of like the social distancing and caring for other people, right? Like that's kind of a first step in this reset experience, which is if you have these ideas to help everybody else and to benefit everybody else and to like engage in this activism work, then like that collective mindset is going to be a pretty significant shift for some folks, and something to keep in mind like right now in this moment, that even though you might be by yourself living alone or with your partner or with a few family members, that like a collective mindset means continuing to keep other people in mind, to stay connected in different ways, to like engage in that activist work and not allow like the social distancing to squish, right? Like meeting together or creating policy or things like that. That if you truly believe in the most amount of people having the best lives that they can have, then it's something that you can take part in many of your actions throughout the day and throughout the week, whatever those look like, and you can get started on doing those now. We don't have to wait until we get over the peak to engage in this hopeful plan.
History is made by people doing things now. We're future history. And I really don't have anything to add to what Julia said because it was pretty dope. So, yeah.
So maybe we can wrap it up there for now. One of the things that I do think would be great to offer, there are plenty of organizations that you can get involved in the Atlanta area and that you can donate to. We also know that it can feel overwhelming, like if you want to get involved or you want to donate or you want to do something, to look these organizations up if you're not in the Atlanta area, because we could share some of those pretty readily. So maybe that's something too that like if you have comments or questions about if you're in a different city, I would be happy to spend a few minutes looking that up and getting that information to you if that's something that's going to help you get started in that process.
Yeah, that's a major part of what we want to be able to do with this podcast is provide, not even provide, we're not providing the resources, but we're helping
Sharing.
direct you, to whatever those resources are, because, like Julie said, it can be daunting to find out, what you can do to help. Well,
Okay, thanks. Bye.
bye.